Hi, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome back to the second part of this wrap-up video for June. It was getting really long and so I thought it made sense to split this up into two videos just so that you weren't there sat kind of for the whole thing. So anyway, there you go, and please do enjoy the rest of the books that I'm about to talk about. Next up, I read 3 advance copies of books that are coming up soon. I don't actually know when they're released, I think fairly soon. The first was 3 Rooms by Joe Hamya, and so this is a book that really explores a very kind of current, it feels, moment of a young black woman who in many ways has done everything quote unquote right. You know, she has gone through education, she has gone to Oxford and has done a PhD, and then basically finds herself working these really monotonous jobs, or when she's not doing that, trying to kind of make ends meet while doing what's almost, I mean, it's a paid internship, but a very, very low paying internship at this kind of media firm. And what's really interesting is how it depicts this kind of struggle and kind of hustle culture, and how essentially young people are expected to kind of go and kind of work ridiculous hours, often doing a lot of unpaid labour to make it, whatever that means, in an industry, and kind of being told that if they complain about the fact that they can't afford their rent or they can't afford to eat, that they are privileged, that they're entitled, that they are not looking at what a great opportunity they've got in front of them. And that's what happens with this internship. She is paying £80 a week to sleep on someone's sofa, and she is being told by people, by the person who's renting her that sofa, that she should be more grateful because she's got a cheap place to stay in London, even when, for example, the person who owns the house isn't cleaning up after herself in the kitchen or in the bathroom, and is expecting the main kind of character to do everything. And it's really interesting because these 3 rooms then basically trace what it's like for her, and it kind of follows, well, it kind of in some ways references Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and this idea of, to be successful, one needs to have their own space that allows them to write and think, and the time to be able to do it, and to be free of distraction. And in many ways that's what we see this character do. We know that she's academically very talented and very skilled. You know, we see that she's got a PhD from Oxford. We then see how she's very good at what she does, well, mostly in this internship, but is still kind of treated like dirt, is paid irregularly, not often paid on time, all of these kinds of things. And then when she complains about it, she's again told that she's entitled. When she comments on sort of being passed over and looked over in what feels to her like either racism or sexism or both, she's told, well, you know, even if it were that, you are still Oxford educated, so suck it up, people have it worse than you. And kind of it feels like no matter where she goes, she is kind of buffeted back in a way that I think for many sort of younger millennials or sort of Gen Z kind of people, that's kind of the reality of the world that's perhaps in front of them. You know, a world where it's kind of this never-ending hustle and kind of gig economy of, if you're not working every single hour, then you are failing, like rest is for the weak, you know, that really pernicious, toxic kind of culture. And so then what's really interesting about this book is how we sort of trace her through that, and it's all told with this really intense narrative that is very cold and detached. And in some ways that was what put me off this book in parts, because it's so detached that we almost don't really get a sense of what's happening. She feels like someone floating through the story as opposed to being the main character, and that can be quite difficult at times. However, I also find it quite difficult to imagine this book without that narrator, because in some ways it makes sense that she's so detached and so cold. She's completely burnt out, she has nothing seemingly going her way, and everyone seems to be treating her like dirt. And so that is something really interesting about this book, is that that tone fits formally but can also be quite off-putting, but that's because the reality of her situation is really off-putting. So really interesting book, I thought. And similarly, another advanced copy that I read this month was how have I literally just forgotten what this book is? was A Painter's Friend, The Painter's Friend rather, by Howard Cunnell. And this is a story of all of this about this young man, well, not young man, he's sort of an older man who was basically formerly a well-known painter, but after a seemingly like some kind of act of violence has been sort of shunned by the community, and the former kind of manager slash friend slash whatever has kind of turned his back on him and is very kind of publicly using this story to kind of further his own sort of thing of sort of saying, oh, you know, it's really sad. We used to be great friends, but isn't it terrible how these things happen? And again, it kind of in some ways sort of similar to some of the other books I've mentioned. There's a sort of almost gaslighting element of the narrative where we are not entirely, well, not gaslighting maybe, but at least we're not meant to fully trust this narrator, because we recognize that this narrator is sort of going in many different directions constantly. His thoughts are kind of everywhere. He's kind of having breakdowns, and it's quite difficult to have a grasp on what reality is. And as a result, we're kind of meant to think, do we follow along with his thoughts? What happened here? What's the truth? What's real? It's a really complex book for that way, in that sense, and some really beautiful, beautiful writing. For me, I don't think the end necessarily got to a place that made that much sense. It was a really gripping, tense sort of final set of pages, but for me, something about it felt again a bit cold. I think it didn't feel like it quite tied up the right questions in a way that made sense. I was still had a few questions at the end of the book that weren't kind of, ooh, I wonder what really happened, but more kind of, did the author forget that they mentioned this earlier in the book? Or it suddenly felt like we shifted to focusing on very different characters towards the end of the book in a way that I didn't really understand. But again, that may well be a me problem. I may have just not been particularly well focused on this book. But again, I do think it did some really interesting things. And I'm really intrigued to try out more of this author's books, because I think his writing style I thought was really interesting and beautiful in places. Next up, another advanced copy I read was Robin DiAngelo's Nice Racism. And so this book is a sort of follow-up in some ways to her sort of massively selling book, White Fragility. And Robin DiAngelo is she's sort of a facilitator and kind of coach on you know, leading sessions on anti-racism work. And a lot of her perspective is what she can do as a white person talking to other white people, in the sense that, you know, a black person talking about racism might not always be taken as seriously, unfortunately, by various white people. And so her sort of approach is largely, how can I, you know, if my voice is more likely to be heard as a white person, what can I do to actively challenge racism? And I had some issues with White Fragility, and I have some issues with this book. And in many ways, they follow a sort of similar trajectory. But anyway, I think I find it quite hard to fully pinpoint my issue with this book, or sort of an issue. I mean, because don't get me wrong, I still think this book does a lot of really good, powerful things. It really encourages you to challenge your perspective and think, am I being a white person who is sort of claiming that racism is solved and looking for the answer to racism, and also not willing to do my own work to do it? I just want to sort of say a few statements and then claim that I don't see colour, and, you know, all those kinds of things. But I think for me, what fundamentally feels a bit off about this book for me is that although throughout Robin DiAngelo references black thinkers and black writers, and she's very cautious and keen to state that a lot of her thought has also come from work with people of colour, I think where the book sort of falls down is who this is really aimed at. Because if this is a book aimed at a white person talking to other white people about racism, this book feels to me like it starts at quite a weird level. It kind of presupposes that you've already read something like White Fragility and you've kind of understood those terms and what have you, and this is kind of the next step. You know, this is the next step along. But what I don't really understand about that is it kind of feels like she's cutting out the middleman, because White Fragility, where it sort of leaves off, I think does leave people in a place where really they should be able to then pick up books by black thinkers and black writers about anti-racism and about racism and their own experiences, and be able to talk about those powerfully and sort of hear straight from someone who's affected. What kind of irked me and sort of sat a bit uncomfortably with me about this book is then sort of working out what the purpose is. Because if that is, if it's meant for people who are fairly new to it, it starts at a really high level. And I think there are many other books that would be better starting points, written often by people of colour, such as Reniero Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and Ijeoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Racism, I think it is. I'll double check that. And both of those books, I think, are really good starting places, and they come from people of colour. And I get, again, that there may be people who are white, who are resistant to hearing voices of colour about racism and about anti-racism. And in some ways, white fragility maybe is a good kind of starting point. But then, so I feel like this book, if it is aimed at white people who want to have that conversation, I feel like it aims too high. But if it is also aimed at people who are at that level to be able to engage with a book like Nice Racism, then I think actually it should just, I feel like it would have been a better use of a platform to encourage people to go and check out books by black thinkers and black authors, and kind of thinkers and authors of colour. I don't, it just kind of sits quite weirdly with me. And I think as a result, it feels, and I don't think it actually is, maybe, but it feels as a result like a little bit of a cash grab. And I don't think that's her intention. But I think what sits kind of uncomfortably with me about that is that it just never quite feels like the pitch is hit right. Because it either feels like it's too advanced for people who are completely new to the conversation, but if it is aiming at people who are more advanced or have had more kind of an experience being part of that conversation, I think there are plenty of other books by people of colour that would hit that target and hit that, engage those conversations a lot better. I don't know. It's a thorny thing. And I think that's not to discount a lot of the good stuff that this book does. It has some really interesting passages. It's incredibly challenging reading it as, for me being white, because it does force you to kind of really look at your own behaviours. So I think there's a lot that's really good and powerful about this book. I just question whether writing another book as a follow-up to White Fragility is the best route, when especially there were many people the only book they read on sort of anti-racism was White Fragility and not anything by people of colour. And so I feel like this kind of furthers that problem, whereas it could have shared almost more of a platform. I don't know. Maybe I'm talking out of my whatever, but that's kind of an issue and a question I had around it. And I still can't quite work out where I land on that discussion. Again, it does some really interesting things. It's not to discount it as a book. Yeah, anyway, there are some question marks for me. On a somewhat lighter note, a few of the books I read next were books that I sort of mentioned in my Pride TBR video, and books I've been meaning to read for a really long time, or that I had kind of around that I thought I should probably read at some point. The first of which was Ali Smith's Girl Meets Boy, which in many ways is sort of a retelling of an Ovid myth about a sort of the idea of gender transformation and sort of characters being able to shift in and out of gender, or kind of experiencing the world differently based on gender. And in very sort of typical Ali Smith style, it has this very kind of quirky sort of subplot and kind of playfulness with language that I just thought was really beautiful. So for example, a character who is working for an ad agency trying to sell water. And Ali Smith very cleverly, I think, weaves in that idea later of the idea of packaging water and sort of saying, oh no, here's how we sell water, here's whatever, is kind of similar to the weird myths that we tell around gender, and how we kind of make out as if gender or sexuality are these kind of monomyths and these kind of stories that we sell, but actually it's so much more varied than that. It's so much richer than just, man does X, woman does Y. And so I think this is really quite interesting and very playful. And yeah, Ali Smith is just an author who I always really enjoy. And so I really appreciate a sort of fun, entertaining little book like this. It's really quite short. It's about, 160 pages. And again, sort of very playful, very sort of silly in parts sort of style. But again, very typically for someone like Ali Smith, is just really, really fascinating. Next I read the Bible, which New Testimonials, which is the second volume, which is a set of essays, sort of personal essays by people, and it's really interesting how this explores it. It's kind of lots of bi people of different genders, all exploring the idea of what it means to them to be bi. For some people, that's things around first crushes. For some people, that's about coming out. For some people, that's finding a sense of identity. And it explores them in quite an interesting way, I thought. I'm not always the biggest fan of sort of big sets of essays, because sometimes I can find that the quality dips up and down. And there were a few in here that I thought were interesting, but I sort of didn't engage with quite as much. But regardless, I thought it was really interesting how she talks about how people in this book talk about their identities and their experiences as bi people, particularly not being bi myself. And I think it's really interesting kind of hearing perspectives of people whose experience of coming out was great, other people's whose were less so. There's one point that sort of almost research essay thing in here talking about what it was like to, what it's like for bi people in education spaces and how often they sort of feel excluded or kind of othered by people around them. So really, really interesting. I also read How to Be Autistic by Charlotte Amelia Poe, which is a really interesting book talking about this young woman's life as she sort of grew up and sort of realised that she was different in some ways, and sort of she speaks really candidly about what it is like for her to be autistic, and particularly the intersections of that with other things. So being autistic and a woman, being autistic and bisexual, being autistic and being into body modification, and all of these really interesting intersections of her identity and what that looks like for her. That, some of her interests mean that she would go to, for example, conventions, and that's quite overwhelming for her as someone who is autistic. But also there was her diagnosis was really late, and so that also meant that she didn't have the support she needed in school. So a really interesting non-fiction book with her talking about her experiences, and I think she really goes into detail in a way that I was kind of learning quite a lot as I went, of just her what autism looks like for her, and how that is, not an experience that could be universalized necessarily, but how she sort of finds that many other autistic people don't necessarily have access to the same voice or the same platform to be able to talk about these things, and how as a result there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding. So really, really interesting book. Next, I read A Book of Dreams by Peter Reich. And I mentioned this in my Kate Bush video. This was the book that was the inspiration behind the song Cloud Busting by Kate Bush. And this book goes into a lot of detail, kind of following Peter Reich, who was, this is non-fiction, this is sort of a memoir of him talking about his life as a young boy, growing up with a father who essentially was wanted by the CIA or the FBI, one of those two, for being sort of seen as essentially a madcap scientist, but who was potentially quite dangerous as a result, because he would look into, for example, what he called organon, the sort of energy life force, and he had all of these other thoughts about what it meant to be what it meant to sort of be a threat in terms of to the government in that sense, who saw his experiments as being sort of somewhat outlandish and him therefore being somewhat dangerous. Now, Peter Reich as a young boy is kind of there not really understanding it. Why is his dad asking him to bury his yo-yo for being kind of light up and therefore potentially radioactive? From Peter's perspective, he sees this as being sort of somewhat unfair, that, it's not causing any harm. He really wants it. He wants to play with it, but he can't because his dad said so. But at the same time, he knows that his dad is in imminent danger, and his dad has sort of prepared him, if anything ever happens to me, don't say this, don't tell anybody about this, don't talk to anyone. And so this young boy grows up both being full of the wonder of being a child, because he's surrounded by all of these incredible designs and scientific experiments and things, and it's so full of wonder and joy. Like, let's learn about the world and let's kind of explore the idea of being able to create clouds and all this kind of fun stuff. But then it's when he also goes to school and he realizes that's not normal. Everyone around him sort of sees him as being quite different and quite alien. He's also an Austrian boy growing up in the US. but also this sort of absolute threat that means he can't really be a child because he has to be aware at any time that his dad might be taken away and he might have to learn how to fend for himself, and he might have to, you know, stop his dad from being locked up by, you know, if he accidentally says the wrong word, he could cause, you know, irrevocable harm. And so it's a really interesting book to kind of trace his story through that. And finally, I read a book, or rather listened to, because it's quite nice to hear it in her voice, On Writers and Writing by Margaret Atwood. And this is her book, sort of based in some ways off a series of lectures she was delivering and kind of then expanded into a book of her talking about what it means to be a writer. And I mean, I love Margaret Atwood and will very happily read pretty much everything of hers. And what's so interesting about this is I know that some people have gone into wanting to read this book expecting that it's going to be a guide of, you know, kind of like Stephen King's On Writing, of how do I become a writer? How do I sit down? And in many ways, Margaret Atwood talks about it in a much more abstract and sort of wider sense of what is the role of the writer? What does it mean to put something down on paper? Who gets to call themselves a writer? Who gets to say that? And so it's a lot more abstract. It's her sort of talking about myths and fairy tales and the tracing of sort of the role of an author over time and all these kinds of things, which is fascinating. But I can imagine it's quite frustrating if you've gone into this imagining it's going to be a how-to guide on how to get published. But what's really great listening to this as an audiobook as well is hearing Margaret Atwood's wonderfully sardonic and dry sense of humor really come through in her voice. I love her voice, her speaking voice. I just find her endlessly fascinating with it because it's both utterly fascinating and enrapturing. Is that a word? Enraptured? Yeah, you can be enraptured, I think. But also that it's just sort of so witty and funny and dry, and she's just a really interesting and fascinating woman. So I really enjoyed this. But I think it can feel a bit navel-gazing, perhaps in parts. But overall, if you are a fan of Margaret Atwood and you're a fan of just thinking about what the role of art is and what the role of the artist is and what writing is and all that kind of stuff, then I think you'll probably quite like this. It's interesting nonetheless, I think. There we go. Anyway, that has been my June wrap up, and I'm slowly sweating as I'm doing this, and I realise I'm wearing a jumper. I'm not really quite sure why I thought that was appropriate or a good idea. But those have been the books that I read in June. I'd love to hear about books that you've read over this month, or if you've read any of the books that I've mentioned here, what your thoughts were on them. I've been Bob the Booker. This has been a bit rambly and a bit kind of off on tangents throughout, so thank you, hopefully, for bearing with me if you're at this part of the video. Thank you again, and take care. Have a wonderful July, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye bye.